During the Second World War, there were thousands of people who were executed inside of Nazi Germany for defying Hitler and refusing to conform to his ideas and politics. The militaries involved in the conflict needed a huge number of people to fight for their countries, and for some people they could not just take up arms because of their religious beliefs. There were thousands of conscientious objectors who refused to join the armies of many nations for their religious beliefs. Some people were excused service in the military for this, but inside of Hitler's Germany, the dictator saw this as a disgrace, and he would sentence many people to death for this. One man who was executed by the guillotine inside of a German prison was Franz Jagerstatter, who was just a humble farmer who could not fight for the Germans during the war. But what is his story? Join us today as we look at the horrific execution of the farmer that stood up to Hitler, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Franz Jagerstatter was born in Upper Austria, in a small village near to Salzburg, and inside of this settlement everyone was Catholic. His father was a farmer, and his mother was a chambermaid, and they were not particularly well off. His parents were not married as they could not afford it, and Franz was looked after by his very strongly Catholic grandmother, Elizabeth Huber. His father was forced to serve in the First World War inside of the army, and in 1915 he was killed in action, when Franz was just 8 years old. His mother would remarry 2 years later to Heinrich Jagerstatter, and Franz was adopted by his stepfather, and he later gave over the farm to him after Franz would later marry. But as a child, Franz was a good student who was very conscientious, but he left school after he was 14. He was described as jolly, robust, fun-loving and hot-blooded, but also intelligent and bull-headed, and he seemed to be above his peers, and someone who wanted to try new things out. He was the first in his village to own a motorbike, and he was a religious man who would regularly attend Mass. He would later become more devoted to his faith, but as a young man he was part of a gang who would have many different fights. His group would fight against members of the Heimwehr, a paramilitary group, after a group of girls paid them more attention, and for this he was locked up in prison for a number of days. But in August 1933, he had an illegitimate daughter named Hildegard, after an affair with a local maidservant. He would pay support for her and visit her, but he was then ousted out of the village for a number of years regarding the paternity of this child, but in the mid-1930s his life changed. Franz became a heavily religious individual, and most of his neighbours said that he changed so suddenly that people could not understand it, almost as if he had been possessed by a higher power. But he later married another deeply religious woman, but they then went on pilgrimage and were even blessed by the Pope. Most people believed his strong conversion was down to his wife, but in Austria at the end of the 1930s things would change heavily. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had seized control and expressed his desire to absorb Austria into the German Third Reich he wished to have. He wanted to unite all German-speaking people under an empire with him at the top as a Führer and the dictator, and in Austria he would march in his soldiers into the country after the country was annexed with the Anschluss. A false vote claimed that over 99% of Austrians wanted to join up with Nazi Germany, but in his village, Franz Jagerstatter was the only person to vote against the plebiscite in the Union. However, the German authorities suppressed his dissent and vote. He could not believe that there were so many Catholics supporting the Nazis, and he wrote, "I believe there could be scarcely a sadder hour for our true Christian faith in our country." He was not involved in any resistance in a sense, but he remained openly anti-Nazi, but he did take part in some military training. But on the 8th of December 1940, he joined the Third Order of St. Francis, and then worked at a local church after he deferred his military service 4 times. He was drafted to begin with in June 1940, but he refused to take the Hitler oath. He was then sent home, and was allowed to work under an exemption as he was a farmer, and was said to have been an important worker to provide more food to people. But he continued to voice his discontent with the Nazis, especially their euthanasia programs, but also their attacks on the church. He then turned against the war, and he wanted to meet with the Bishop of Linz to discuss these points, but he was not able to get the outcome he wanted. Franz Jagerstatter was then called into active duty on the 9th of February 1943 within the German army. He was furious with this, and he was forced to leave his wife and 3 young children behind, and he would state he did not want to fight for Nazi Germany. Because of this, he declared his conscientious objection, and he decided to resist fighting. He even offered to serve the army in a non-military capacity as a stretcher bearer or a medic, but this was rejected. For his objection, Jagerstatter was arrested and was placed in custody inside of the army. He was transferred to Linz where he was held, and he was then moved to Berlin, as he was considered a serious offender. Whilst he was in prison, he was visited by a priest from his village, who told him to just serve in the army but to not take a life, but Franz was not willing to do this. He was willing to die for his beliefs, and he was then brought to trial. In front of a military trial at the highest military court in Nazi Germany, Franz Jagerstatter was charged with undermining military morale and causing damaging dissent to the Wehrmacht. For this he was sentenced to death and was to be killed for his refusal to fight for the German army. He was taken to the Brandenburg Garden prison and was told to await his execution. During the Second World War, this became one of the selected execution sites established by Hitler's regime to take the lives of many people. An execution chamber was created, and it was set up in what was previously a garage and had been fitted with a guillotine and a gallows. It was similar to Plötzensee prison, which also had a guillotine and a hanging beam, and inside this execution chamber, over 2,700 people would be executed inside that very room. The youngest victim of this chamber would be a young 15-year-old French boy, but on the 9th of August 1943, Franz Jagerstatter was taken from his prison cell into the execution chamber. Shockingly, as he entered the execution chamber, there was an official there that gave him the option to escape his death. He was asked to sign a document that would recant his objections, and if he signed this, he would have been spared. But he refused to do so, and refused to be complicit in anything to do with the Nazis. His final words before his death were, "I'm completely bound in inner union with the Lord." He was then strapped to a wooden board by the executioner's assistant, who secured his hands and feet also, before he was quickly slid under the guillotine blade. Then the executioner made a few final checks before he released the blade, and Franz Jagerstatter, the conscientious objector, was executed. There were many more people who conscientiously objected to serve in the Second World War and refused to carry arms. For example, Desmond Doss, the heroic stretcher-bearer, who would become a valiant figure. Franz Jagerstatter defied the Nazis and their attacks on the church, and he was a man who would, rather than compromise on his principles, decided to go to the guillotine. The fact he had a chance to save his life but refused to do so is an interesting one, and it shows you the devotion he had to his religion and his beliefs, but also the hatred he had for the Nazis. The story of Franz Jagerstatter is one that isn't the most well known, but it's one that deserves to be remembered. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.